looking at the global south and this impunity with which Donald Trump is acting. He's like a runaway train without brakes at this point in time. Executive order after executive order that he is signed as well. And, again, you mentioned find alternatives and call his bluff. And let's just talk a bit about those alternatives and more so from the global south in holding Donald Trump accountable for the statements that he's making.
Well, in fact, that's what's behind the whole Article 6 campaign, because we have identified, you know, let me sort of preface this by saying that the Article 6 campaign isn't specifically uh, uh, designed to, how to say this, sort of single America out. America has singled itself out by their own behavior. What we are interested in is international law being applied. We're interested in equality before the law by every nation, that every nation should be under the law, not above the law. But America has acted above the law ever since 1945, ever since the establishment of the United Nations. And we have identified that the source of their power, for lack of a better word, the source of their power, what has enabled them to run rampant across the globe, across the global south, has not been their actual power. Their actual power hasn't been their economic power, it hasn't been their political power, it hasn't been their military power. What has enabled them to act this way has been their impunity. And it is an impunity that they have secured for themselves by their domination of the United Nations. And that if they can be removed, and rather I should say when they are removed from the United Nations, then they will cease to be above the law and they will be under the law like everyone else. And they will be subject to the law like everyone else, because the way that they have operated was that international law is something that only ever applies to their enemies, to their victims, or to their perceived enemies or victims, or who they want to take from, who they want to colonize, who they want to exploit. This is their very, excuse me, very selective application of international law, and it has never applied to them. So what we're actually, what at the core of the Article 6 campaign is a call for justice, is a call for equal justice for all nations, with no one having impunity, no one having unaccountability, and no one being above the law. And it just happens to be the case that the most persistent violator of of the principles of the United Nations Charter, the most persistent, the most consistent, and the most insistent violator of the principles of the UN Charter just happens to be the United States of America. If it was Cuba, then we would call for Cuba to be removed from the United Nations. If it was China, then we would call for China to be removed. If it was any other country that had so persistently violated the principles of the UN Charter with impunity, then we would call for that country to be expelled. But it just happens to be the case that America has proven itself to be, over the last 8 decades or so, to be the chief violator of the UN Charter, the chief violator of international law, and the abuser of the entire international legal system, the entire international system of justice, until we've reached a point that no one even takes the concept seriously. No one even takes the concept of international justice seriously. All of these institutions of international justice, whether it's the ICJ or the ICC or the United Nations or any the World Court, anything, even the concept of international law has lost all credibility, because it's never applied to the country that everyone has suffered at their hands. It has never been applied to the country that is the chief violator of international law, which just makes the whole concept of international law and international justice lose all credibility. So we've identified that the source of America's power, again, for lack of a better word, the source of their power, the enabler of their savagery, the enabler of their brutality, the enabler of their global oppression, has been their impunity. And so we've determined that the best way to solve that problem is to remove that impunity from them, so that then they will be subject to the law.
In terms of this campaign in revoking Article 6, how do you see this campaign impacting global governance and the credibility of international law, considering the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not even speak to what we see happening around us, the injustices, the oppression that is taking place?
Well, I think that the campaign, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, the campaign, when successful, inshallah, will restore credibility to the concepts of international law and international justice, because the domination of the UN by the United States, the persistent violations of the United States, of the UN Charter and of international law, without consequences, without accountability, with full impunity, this has bankrupted the concept of international justice, and it has bankrupted those very precious documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which have never been applied to Western crimes. We consider, of course, the Nakba to be a Western crime. This is a crime of Western colonization, and it has never been applied when America or its allies have committed these types of crimes. And this has completely discredited the whole concept of international law and international justice among the global population, because the majority of the global population, of course, is not Western, is not white, is not in the global North, is in the global South, and they have been the victims of America, victims of American foreign policy, victims of exploitation, colonization, and so forth from the West. When they see, there was, a moment in 1945 and 1948 when they signed that document, when they created the United Nations, there was a moment when everyone thought, well, maybe it's over now. Maybe the suffering and the enslavement and the exploitation and the oppression, maybe it will end now because we've got these legal documents. But no one understood at that time that the people who drafted those documents never had the slightest intention of having those documents applied to them. That their intention was that those documents would only ever be used against their victims, against the oppressed, against the global South, against the colonies, and so forth. So I believe that when we get the United States expelled from the United Nations, we would restore the credibility of not just the United Nations, but of even the entire concept of international law, international justice, to show that we don't actually have to have a completely hypocritical system. We don't actually have to tolerate these double standards. We don't actually have to tolerate any country being above the law. We can actually have equal justice. These are things that aren't empty, but they have been drained of their meaning by America's domination of the UN. And I think that we would see, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, once America is expelled from the United Nations and is then held accountable by the United Nations for its 8 decades of crimes, for its 8 decades of violations. I mean, this is one of the reasons why they're so hostile to the ICC. This is one of the reasons why they're so hostile to the ICJ, because they know they're supposed to be on the dock. They know perfectly well that they're supposed to be on the dock. They're supposed to be prosecuted for like I've talked about many times. If we were to go to any country in the world, any country, even in the West, even in Europe, we could find America violating the UN Charter, violating international law against that country persistently from 1945 until today. You could literally throw a dart at a map of the world, and anywhere it lands, you'd be able to make a case for persistent violations. So America knows very well that they are eligible for prosecution for crimes against humanity, for war crimes, and for many, many other violations of international law. So the fact that we have all endured that for 8 decades without ever seeing any accountability, without ever seeing any consequences imposed upon the chief criminal, that has caused a great deal of pessimism, a great deal of cynicism, and a great deal. I mean, we see it all the time when we do live streams about the Article 6 campaign, and we get many comments from people who say the United Nations is worthless, international law doesn't matter, international law is a joke, the United Nations is a joke, America can never be removed from the United Nations, America is too powerful, it's too strong, and so on and so on and so on. This is what it's done to people psychologically. This is how it has affected people psychologically, and how demoralized people are with the concept of justice, with the concept of international justice, with the idea that the nations of the world can actually come together and run the affairs of this planet by consensus. But we see it happening in the General Assembly. We see all of the 193 countries in the world coming to a consensus on every issue. You hardly ever see any vote at the United Nations that goes 50-50. or where everybody in the General Assembly takes a different view. It always comes down to a consensus, and that consensus is consistently overruled by the United States. So there isn't actually, in reality, there's no reason to believe that international justice is a fraud. There's no reason to believe that it's a hoax. There's no reason to believe that it's impossible for there to be international law or for there to be justice globally. You have to identify the actual reason why we have not had that until now. And the reason that we haven't had that until now is that the United States has dominated all of the institutions that are charged with the enforcement of international law. So I think that once we get them removed, we will see a huge change in not only the practical application of international law and the practical enforcement of international law, but we will see a huge change in the sentiments of the population, where people will actually feel that justice actually is achievable when they see America at the dock, when they see America suffering the consequences of their actions, suffering the consequences of their 8 decades of violations of the UN Charter. When they see justice actually being applied, that's when people can start to believe in justice again. But the fact that we haven't seen justice applied, and the only time that we've ever seen so-called justice applied is when it has been applied against America's enemies, when it has been applied against America's victims. That's the only time that we've ever seen it. And they've even said as much, that the International Court is actually for them, meaning people in the global south, meaning enemies of the West, designated hostile enemies of the West. That they've actually said it, that this is what the court is supposed to be for. It's not supposed to be for Westerners. It's not supposed to be for white people. It's not supposed to be for America. But it is. It's for everyone. It's for anyone who violates international law. And so once you see it actually applied equally, then people can start to have to restore their belief in the concepts of justice.
So, just taking a look at some of the other permanent members, for example, Russia or China, these are countries that have also committed violations.
Okay, sure. Let me start with Russia and China. Russia is relatively new in terms of it being as a member, because it was formerly the Soviet Union. For the majority of time that the United Nations existed, it was the Soviet Union. So that has now ceased to exist. But Russia itself certainly has violated the UN Charter. China has violated the UN Charter, but have they done it persistently? Have they done it persistently and consistently and insistently? This is what the Article 6 requires. This is the criteria. Not just that you violate it. I don't think you could find any country that hasn't violated it to one extent or another, or any way that could be interpreted to have violated it convincingly. But China and Russia have not violated it persistently. Meaning, if you look at the violations committed by the United States, like I've said, you could go decade by decade, and just in one decade you could find persistent violations in terms of the scale of their violations. In other words, it isn't just one violation in one country, it's multiple violations in every country, in every decade of the United Nations existence. And we talk about many of the examples of the violations of the UN Charter by America in our live streams. And I would invite everyone to join us on those live streams so that you can get more information. We won't have time to go into all of it today because, again, the violations are simply too many to list. So why we would not target China or Russia for this is because they don't qualify, just basically in terms of the quantity of their violations. Now, with regards to Israel, there's no question that morally Israel is qualified. There's no question that legally Israel is qualified for expulsion from the United Nations. There's no question about it. But all of Israel's crimes are American crimes. All of Israel's crimes are American crimes. There's not a single thing that Israel has done to violate international law, to violate the principles of the UN Charter, that hasn't been enabled by America, that hasn't been funded by America, and where America hasn't provided cover for Israel at the United Nations Security Council. The genocide that we have all been witnessing for the last 15 months has been a genocide by veto, because there should have been a ceasefire from the beginning. But who vetoed it? America vetoed it again and again and again. All of Israel's crimes are America's crimes. If you solve the problem of American impunity and American global violence, you will already solve the problem of Israel. Now that's just from a basic moral understanding, but from a practical strategic understanding, trying to expel Israel from the United Nations is a non-starter, strategically, practically speaking. It's not something that can happen for the same reason that you couldn't get a ceasefire, because America will veto it. If we try to expel Israel from the United Nations, America will veto it before we even get the paper submitted. So, practically speaking, it's not something that can be done. It's a non-starter. There's no question that legally they are eligible for expulsion. They should be expelled. Morally, there's no question about it. But practically speaking, it's unachievable. And furthermore, I would say that as I just said, all of their crimes fall at the feet of America. All of their crimes are in America's file. The file that will be that we will be presenting, inshallah, to or when a member state raises Article 6 to the UN Security Council, all of Israel's crimes, all of the file of Israel's crimes will be in America's file, because all of those crimes have been enabled by, have been funded by, have been armed by, and have had cover provided for them by the United States. Israel and America are one entity. Israel is nothing but America's policy in the Middle East, or anyway, that's what it has been, at least since the establishment of Israel, at least since the establishment of the United Nations. So you're solving the Israel problem by the removal of the United States, because then they won't have their big brother anymore at the Security Council to veto them, to veto any action taken against them, to hold them up above international law, because the global consensus has always been on the side of the Palestinians, meaning the global consensus has always been on the side of justice. And Israel is not capable of standing up against the entire global community. They're only able to do what they have been able to do because of American backing. So once America is expelled from the United Nations, then Israel will be subjected to international law, and they will have to comply.